Chris Nissen is a friend of mine and one of the best artists to have emerged from art class at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. Sometime in the late 1970s, he and some other PAFA students set out to meet Andrew Wyeth. Chris told the tale on a radio show. Facebook won't let you post audio, so I turned this into a static video so you could listen. It's a great story told by a great artist.
I'm Dick Gordon. This is The Story. Many of us, at some early time in our lives, have a brief encounter with someone who makes a deep impression. The painter, Chris Nissen, has a story like that. He wrote in to tell me about meeting with the artist Andrew Wyeth at a time when Chris was looking for some direction in his life. See, Chris was 26 when he enrolled in art school, so he was older than the other students. Before that, he'd worked in computer marketing.
I was studying the mailing labels, and a catalog came across my desk from the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, and I said, now that's something I should have taken seriously and something I should have done. And eventually, about a year later, I left that job and went to art school.
And how good were you?
Not very.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it was a tough struggle because I had really never had any formal art training, just, art classes in elementary school and early junior high school. I remember particularly one time I took a painting in, one of the first paintings that I took in for a critique, and the teacher came over to me and said, Mr. Nissen, how many dollars worth of paint do you have? Do you have a lot of it? And I said, sure, why is that? He said, well, you might want to consider selling it, going home for a year and cutting out colored paper, and then come back and talk to me. So,
ouch.
That was a kind of a brutal entry into the reality of art school.
Chris Nissen stayed. In his first year, he and 3 other students decided they needed to get out of the studio to find landscapes that might inspire them. So they'd hop in Chris's car and head to the countryside. One day, they found themselves in Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania, home to the famous landscape artist, Andrew Wyeth. Chris had long been a fan of his work. Chris's friend Pat had an idea. Let's go visit him. Chris was pretty nervous about the reception they'd get. He'd heard that Wyeth was, well, known to value his privacy.
As I recall, we drove down a long driveway and pulled up at the house and said, okay, Pat, this is your idea. Why don't you go knock on the door? And, of course, I kept the engine running in case we had to beat a hasty retreat because I was pretty skeptical of how this was going to turn out. We watched him walk up to the door constantly. I remember he was constantly looking back at us, thinking, gee, maybe this is not the right thing to do.
And now he's getting nervous, right?
He's getting nervous, and when we saw him getting nervous, then we immediately started really sweating because he was the only one who had some confidence. So he eventually got to the door, knocked a couple times, and I couldn't see who opened the door, but I saw the door open a crack. And just for maybe 15 or 20 seconds, and back he came running to the car, and I said, oh, my God, let's get out of here now. But he said, no. He said, he's with dealers. Come back next week.
He'd spoken to Wyeth at the door?
He had actually spoken to Andrew Wyeth at the door, and he was very quick with his words, but said, please come back next week.
Well, that was progress. I mean...
Well, it was progress, although I can say that going to art school with these 4 people, we had developed a relationship where we pulled pranks on each other all the time. And we were assuming that Pat was actually had been thrown out of the property and was just trying to get us to bite on this story.
So you weren't buying what he said?
It took us a day or two to really buy the story. And I think even when we went back the next time, I was still a little skeptical.
So you did go back the next week?
We did. We went back the next week. We were all primed and not really quite sure what we were going to find. And we'd all thought about what we were going to ask and what we were going to say. And as we were driving down the driveway, the nerves hit all of us again. I pulled the car up and we went over to the door. And there was a little scrap of paper on the door. And we knocked on the door and no one was there. And we thought, well... It wasn't the true story, apparently, but we pulled the paper off the door and looked, and it was a note that said something to the effect that sorry I couldn't make it today, but one of my dogs was hit by a car, and I'm on the way to the vet, so please come back next week, and I'd love to talk with you. Signed, Andrew Wyeth.
And what are you thinking, that this is one more delay, or that maybe next week you'll actually get to meet the artist?
You know what, I was in between both of those feelings. I thought, you know what, maybe something else came up, and he's a busy man, and he's got a lot of responsibilities, and maybe that's just a gentle way of letting us down. But then part of me said, you know what, let's just go with it and try to come back, and maybe he really is totally sincere.
And so the four of you, did you resolve to go back the next week?
We resolved to go back the next week, and we continued to keep our little trip to Chad's Ford a secret from everyone at school.
Wait a second. You didn't tell anyone that you'd been the first time to the painter's
We
house?
told no one. We actually agreed on that it would have been, first of all, we were afraid that we would draw hundreds of people with us and turn the little trip of 4 into a big circus. So we thought we would just, for the time being, kind of keep it to ourselves.
I'm trying to get this now. The 4 first-year art students have this rendezvous with Andrew Wyeth, and they're not telling anyone else in the class. You must have been glancing across the room at each other through the week.
As a matter of fact, every time we walked down the halls or the studios and kind of crossed each other, we'd shoot these glances at each other like, did you say anything? Did you say anything? Do you believe this is happening? And I'm sure if people had looked at us, they would have suspected something was afoot.
I'm Dick Gordon. You're listening to The Story. The artist, Andrew Wyeth, is known for the detail and the cool colors in his landscapes. Perhaps you've seen that wind-blown scene of the young woman in the pale pink dress lying in the brown grassy field looking back at the farmhouse. That one's called Christina's World, and it's one of Wyeth's best-known pieces. Chris Nissen and his art school friends were big fans of the painter. They went back.
Well, the third trip, we thought this is either a make it or break it trip. So we summoned our courage up, and we talked about in the car what we might ask and what we might say. And we really had no clue as we slowly walked over to the door of the house and knocked on the door. And within an instant, the door opened, and there was Andrew Wyeth. And I think we all were kind of panicked because now the reality of meeting this man who was so famous and so accomplished had really hit us. But immediately he put us at ease with a smile and with a couple questions, and we knew right away that he was a really genuine, good guy who would be very nice to us and very gentle with us.
And what did you get from him? I mean, did he look at his wristwatch and say, all right, folks, you've got 15 minutes, or what happened?
Well, he immediately took us into his studio, which was like entering some kind of chapel, because I understand that very few people have been allowed to go into his studio.
Now, the studio, was it part of the main house, or is it separate?
It was actually a separate building, a stone building, kind of like an old mill building, but it was just remarkably beautiful and elegant inside, simple, large, cavernous. And when he opened the door and let us in there, it was just like something magical we knew was in store for us.
Chris, if you can, just close your eyes and take me back to what you remember from the studio, just stepping into it.
I remember him opening the door and looking in, and the first thing that attracted my attention was in the center of the room. There was a huge model of a wooden mill, and I'm guessing, as I recall back, I think that was probably 10 or 12 feet high and 10 feet around, a beautiful, intricate model of a wooden windmill. And covered on all sides of the wooden mill at the base were dozens and dozens of painted tin soldiers. He told us actually that he had gotten from his dad. They were some of his most valued possessions. And then as we looked around the room, there were several paintings hanging on the walls, some egg tempera paintings, the very detailed ones, and racks and racks and racks of watercolors and drawings, and sitting there looking at going from painting to painting to painting to painting. And it was amazing because I had never seen any of those paintings published or reproduced before, so it was quite an adventure.
Were they all distinctly Wyeth's?
Oh, they absolutely were. I remember there were a couple of tree stumps, simple drawings of tree stumps in that incredible detail and with that care of observation that just were fascinating to see. He went on and told us about 10 or 12 paintings and how he'd done them, what materials he'd used, how sometimes he used his fingers or the button on his shirt or sticks that he picked up off the ground to work into the paint. It was really a fascinating tale of how these paintings were constructed. One of us, I'm not sure who it was, asked him about abstract painting, because his work seemed to be as far from abstract painting as it could possibly be. But he amazed me, I think he amazed all of us, when he started talking about his love of some abstract painting. He mentioned de Kooning particularly, and some of de Kooning's landscapes from Long Island that were very abstract. And his love of abstract painting and his knowledge of it was incredible to me. And then he went on to tell us how that he used that knowledge to kind of underpin the detail of his paintings. In fact, he looked at the abstract qualities of the paintings first, and then he added the detail later, which was, for me at that time, a real discovery, and it's something I still think about when I'm working today.
It's interesting to hear you say that, Chris, because if Wyeth got any criticism, and he did get criticism from the art world, it was because people thought him too much a picture maker rather than a painter, too much of a realist.
That's exactly right. He was really looked upon, certainly by the quote-unquote art establishment, as a painter, I guess you would say a painter of the people, whose works were just overburdened with nostalgia and detail. And I think I was certainly thinking while we were speaking with him that if only the critics and those people had listened to what he was telling us, they would have held him in a whole different light. But I was also impressed that we asked him whether that whole thing bothered him about not receiving his due. And he said that, he never thought about critics. He never thought about painting for anyone else. He painted for himself. He wasn't angry. He wasn't jealous of anything. He just was so into his own work that's what preoccupied him. And I thought that was such a wonderful thing to hear from him.
Chris Nissen is an artist whose career was changed by one meeting he had with the landscape artist Andrew Wyeth more than 30 years ago. Chris and his friends were surprised that they were invited into the artist's home, since he was so well known to guard his privacy.
That's something I wondered about that day while we were there, and I wondered about it. I've wondered about it up until this point, and I think that I think he sensed maybe some connection with us simply because we were landscape painters. We were painting in Chadds Ford. We certainly weren't threatening to him in any way, and I think he maybe relished his role a little bit as being a teacher, because he spoke with us about how his dad, N.C. Wyeth, the illustrator and painter, had really helped him to develop as a painter and an artist. And when he mentioned that to us, I thought maybe he was receiving some sort of satisfaction in trying to give us a little bit of a boost and help us out a bit also.
Did he ever tell you the story of behind the wooden mill and the tin soldiers?
He told us only that they were things that he had been fascinated with his whole life, starting as a child, and he had played with those tin soldiers and painted them. And they were always very dear to him, and I think some of them were his dad's and some of them were his that he had been given, but he valued that collection. You could tell by the way they were displayed so carefully and so beautifully on the mill.
And was there any one bit of artist's advice he gave you at that time that you still refer back to?
Well, I think the fundamental thing that I've been thinking about this recently, and it's something that as I look back on today, it seems to be common sense. But his advice was to paint what you see, to paint what you know, and to paint what you love or what you become obsessed with, of trying to discover as much about it as you can. It seems like obvious advice today, but back as an art student, when we were trying to figure what our niche was in the whole scheme of things, that advice was just fundamentally earth-moving for us. And I think about that all the time and how that fundamentally changed what it is that I do and how I do it.
You're listening to The Story. I'm Dick Gordon. After the meeting with Wyeth, Chris Nissen decided to start painting what he knew best, the city of Philadelphia. And he says he started to get some really good pieces.
The first one probably was painted from the Ben Franklin Bridge. It's a major bridge between Philadelphia and Camden in New Jersey. And there's an elevated walkway that goes up over the bridge. And the four of us would go up on the bridge and paint. And I remember one day looking at this painting. It was a painting of Delaware Avenue, a major thoroughfare that ran under the bridge by the edge of the river. And I said to myself, you know what, I think that's what he was talking about. I think that's what I've been trying to find. And it was a real moment for me of recognition that in fact, you can make changes in your work, and by listening to good advice, you can direct yourself and go to a different level.
Where's that painting now? Do you know?
The original of that painting is still in my possession. A later version of it was, for me, a real changer because it was purchased by the Pennsylvania Academy for their collection. My first year out of school, that was a purchased painting, so that was a proud moment for me to have a painting in the art school museum where I went to school, and it was one that was brought about by listening to some of Andrew Wyeth's advice.
And for people who are listening to our conversation but can't see it, what was in that painting that clicked, that worked?
I think it was just the pattern of the roads disappearing along the edge of the river towards the horizon, intersected by other buildings. It's a strange confluence of shapes and forms at that place. It just kind of clicked together as this beautiful, intricate pattern of shapes and geometry. What started with a trip to Chadds Ford where we were all dying to find subject matter and unable to really know what to paint, ended up 4 years later as having just a wealth of information to paint, and it changed. I think it changed all of us that way. It made it easier for us.
He died earlier this year. I wonder what was going through your mind when you heard that news.
It was a very sad day. It brought a lot of memories of that day 30 years ago to mind, and I think about him often when I'm painting outside. I would often say, what would he say? What would he say about the way I'm using this color? Or what would he say about the way that this abstract shape has been used? I still think about it, his determination to pursue his own work and his style, come hell or high water. It's a wonderful example, I think, for painters or for anyone, really.
The painter Chris Nissen joined me from a studio in Philadelphia, a radio studio. We have a link to the websites of both Andrew Wyeth and Chris. On our website, you can find us at thestory.org.